It's 4 in the morning, and 40 blurry-eyed travelers arrive, 2 by 2, to a predetermined meeting point at SeaTac Airport. They are met by a travel agent they do not know, a rabbi they barely know, and a Jewish Federation staff member whose face is a little more familiar, to whom they look for instruction. Last-minute directions are doled out, anxious questions about layovers and connections are answered, and off they go. They have chosen and been chosen to spend the next 10 days together halfway around the world as part of Seattle's first Honeymoon Israel cohort. Most of these couples come from mixed heritage families, where one partner does not identify as Jewish while the other does. They have all begun to navigate the question of where Judaism and Jewish community fits within their lives, and have all opted to invest their resources into this deep dive of Jewish experiential education. Each of these couples has already committed to building community together, back here in Seattle upon their return. This is no trip for the faint or shy of heart. Over the next 10 days, these couples will experience the joys of Israel, from Shabbat in Jerusalem to dreamy wanderings against Mediterranean backdrops, as well as the sorrows, with a powerful visit to Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, and a drive through the West Bank, all while piled together in a tour bus, day in and day out. They are tasked with asking themselves the question, where does Jewish community fit into our lives, and how do we want to create it together? As you may have guessed, I was the rabbi accompanying those intrepid souls this past May. We began the trip with a palpable dip into Jewish time and space as Shabbat arrived in Jerusalem not long after we did. Our first of 2 Shabbat experiences together, and indeed the entire trip, was framed by a talk by acclaimed Jewish educator Avraham Infeld. Having had occasion to hear Infeld speak during his years as the director of Hillel International, I knew him to be a provocative thinker and a proponent of pluralistic Judaism. As our stomachs filled and the bountiful dinner slowed, Infeld stood to address the room. He regaled us with a story whose message lay the foundation for the next 10 days. He told us about his decision to move to Israel from South Africa as a young person, where he would study Jewish history at the Hebrew University. "Jewish history," his father bellowed. "Jews don't have history, we have memory." The claim is perhaps as bold as his delivery of it was, especially for us moderns who know the importance of the study of history. In his book, Passion for a People, Infeld elaborates, "History is knowing what happened in the past. Memory is asking yourself what those past events have to do with you today and tomorrow. These days of awe are filled with reminders to remember, as the word Zachor appears time and again. Rosh Hashanah is known as Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembering, because according to Jewish tradition, it is the day when God remembers and reviews our spiritual ledgers and remembers why we are worth noticing. The remembering is meant for us too, a day set apart to remind us what is important and why we are worthy of being noticed, of being remembered by a compassionate God. Yom Kippur too is full of reminders to remember. Yizkor is perhaps the best example, as we set aside part of our Day of Atonement to visit the memories of our loved ones who have died and remind ourselves to remember the lessons of their lives. Our Amidah prayer, the central liturgical unit of our day-to-day lives throughout the year, carries with it that insertion of the Yimim Noraim. Zochreinu lechaim, melech chafetz b'chaim. Remember us unto life, sovereign who delights in life. We are reminded to remember on these most holy days, but the command stays with us year-round. We humans have a complex relationship with memory. Acclaimed author of Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie, wrote that God gave us memory so that we might have roses in December. Certainly, memory serves to fill our coffers of wistfulness, but if memory doesn't have the capacity to change us and inspire us toward action, then it is useless. According to Greek mythology, memory was a deity who became mother to all of the muses, the creative forces behind the arts, literature, and science. These ancients understood that creative action flows from being connected to that which has come before, and that action, newness, and progress require memory to precede them. It is counterintuitive to think of remembering as an active verb when it is one that so often happens within our inner world. Perhaps this is why memory in Judaism is enacted so often in the public sphere. It keeps us accountable to our covenant with God, the role as partners in the ever-unfolding creation of the world. The verb to remember, zachor, appears more than 200 times in the Torah, far exceeding any other. Both Israel and God are commanded to remember various events, wonders, and of course, certain agreements made between the two. In his book on the relationship between Jewish history and Jewish memory, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi suggests that this repeated command to remember has been central to our people's survival in the diaspora. We are commanded to remember Shabbat. We are commanded to remember the Exodus from Egypt every year as if we ourselves had been there. We are, curiously, commanded to remember the biblical enmity between the Israelites and the Amalekites, despite the same concurrent commandment to blot out their name from the world. We look at the three root letters that make up Zachor, and we see a panoply of variations on this theme: to remember, to mention, to celebrate, to be reminded, to be mindful, to be remembered for blessing, or to refer to someone of blessed memory. One of the first lessons learned in the study of Torah is that we must pay very close attention to words that are repeated. Rabbi Gidon Rothstein suggests that these commandments to remember, this fixation on Jewish memory, helps us develop our core values. We have a lot to remember in our daily lives, from work-related tasks to family and home, not to mention our social obligations and personal pursuits. So when Torah adds a command to Zachor over and above that, he writes, it's telling us to give these memories a more prominent place, to have them become central to who we are. We need look no further than the words emblazoned above our ark for our starting point. These 10 commandments are prime examples of the ways in which our core values are shaped by what we remember. One of Judaism's most powerful innovations and contributions to the world is the notion of ethical monotheism, that we are bound in a covenantal relationship with a singular deity who cares about what we do and how we treat one another. Contained within these commandments are reminders of how we are to remain in right relationship with those around us. Our sages teach that there are, in fact, 613 commandments within the Torah. Whether or not they use the word zachor, they are all meant to be remembered and then performed. From consideration for vulnerable populations to the daily reminder that we are to treat the stranger that dwells with us as one of us. These commandments are meant to shape how we interact with the world. Perhaps that is what didn't sit well with Enfeld's father. History gives us facts and dates where memory, specifically Jewish memory, sparks action. One blisteringly hot, glorious Seattle summer Sunday, while driving home from our weekly trip to the farmer's market, we caught sight of a man sitting on the hot pavement, leaning against a lamppost and struggling to stay upright. People were walking past him. Cars driving by, business carrying on as usual in the shops just a few feet away from where he lay. My first thought was, surely someone has already checked on him and is going for help. That thought was followed quickly by the realization that he was in fact in distress and alone. As my husband and I verbalized this realization to each other, we turned the car around and drove back. We knew that if we could drive right past, then so could just about everyone else. Rusty's legs were bandaged from the knee down. He was hoping to make it to the farmer's market on that beautiful day. He hadn't accounted for the toll the heat would take on his body and had collapsed upon his exit from the bus. A fellow passenger had helped him cross the street, but it was clear he was not strong enough to carry on his day as he had planned. We called emergency services and waited together for their arrival. While I was talking to him, a young woman approached from across the street with a cold drink for him. The medics arrived and began to assess Rusty's condition, and as they did, the young woman and I talked. She was out for a run. She saw him collapse on the ground and was shocked to see that nobody in the vicinity offered to help. Rusty smiled and called us angels. "That's very kind of you," I said, "but this situation didn't call for angels. It called for human beings." I share this story not to be self-congratulatory, but because it was a moment when action was inspired by memory. Our core values are what caused us to turn around and offer Rusty a hand. My husband and I were both raised on a pretty steady diet of ethical monotheism, and like to think that we've internalized many of our tradition's commandments to remember our obligations to each other. Those were the voices that shouted from our hearts and made us turn around. Maimonides teaches us that memory itself is not enough. Rather, it is the emotions that are stirred and maintained by memory that matter because they lead us to action. Our world is hurting. Once again, the voices of hatred have been emboldened. Encouraged by vitriol and fear to maintain our distance and demonize the other, we could easily turn a blind eye against the suffering around us. The suffering that we endorse, implicitly or explicitly, when we fail to remember. Jewish history teaches us to never forget, and yet, not only do we find ourselves swimming in the rising tides of anti-Semitism, but in all sorts of hatred and xenophobia. Houses of worship of all faiths are violently attacked. Children separated from their parents and incarcerated at our borders. Our oceans are warming and our climate is changed, and the very planet itself cries out to be remembered. Those that would have us forget our obligations to the world around us have turned up the volume on their megaphones, and we find ourselves either shouting back or dropping out. It is not our obligation to complete the task of perfecting the world, teaches the ethics of our fathers, but neither are we free to desist from it. Those 20 honeymooners who set out last May to explore the land of Israel and their relationship to Judaism now take on the mantle of this work, of remembering to see themselves reflected in Jewish memory. Former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, Jonathan Sacks, writes, "There is no sense in Judaism of the atomic individual, the self in and for itself that we encounter in Western philosophy from Hobbes onward. Instead, our identity is bound up horizontally with other individuals, our parents, spouse, children, neighbors, members of the community, fellow citizens, fellow Jews. We are also joined vertically to those who came before us, whose story we make our own. We recite the Ashamnu, our alphabet of woes, in the plural because we are bound up in this human enterprise together. Missing the mark is encoded in our spiritual DNA. It is part of the paradoxicality of our humanity. But so is the potential for remembering how to hit the mark more often than not. We are a people of action. We are a people of memory, a people of the book and of the deed. As we plead to be remembered unto life in the coming year, we ask to be made mindful of the life and lives and unfolding right in front of us. May we understand that the remembering is up to us, that it must inspire us to action, and if we want to be worthy of taking our place within the ever-unfolding Jewish memory.